Hello, Maddie here. We are having story time this week and talking about how we ended up rescuing not two, but actually three Amish horses that had been dumped and sort of the journey that has been. They were scheduled to ship to be sold for meat within days of when we were actually able to purchase and secure them. So this is that story. This is part two. If you haven't caught part one yet, you can click here, or actually I'll just drop that link below as well so that you can go back and watch that and sort of figure out where all of this started. Now, I left you guys wondering yesterday what message I got and what was going to happen next and where this third horse came from. So let's start there. So I get a message from this Facebook organization that says they're a rescue and they want to know if I can take Snowflake. I had not looked around on the website where these horses were listed because I figured two was going to be more than enough for me to try to not only bail out of there, but get them home and then continue to fund and care for them, right? So I tell the organization as much. And at this point, they're like, well, this is her. They send me her link. It's got her video, some details, which are always really minimal because they don't really know either. And who knows if who dropped this horse off was being honest. But she's essentially this big, giant Belgian gray mare. Well, actually, I think she was a Percheron cross, but either way, she's massive. You can tell she's old. You can see some medical problems she's having even in the video that they played for me. And I just thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with three horses? But basically they say, we have the funds to bail her out. We have somebody that will pay to get her out. Can you please find somewhere for this horse to go? All right, you guys. So two horses the size of elephants is one thing. Three is just getting to be a little touchy for me. I'm getting a little nervous about considering what am I going to do with three? What if I can't fundraise enough money to support her if she does come here? At this point, I recognize my own limitations. I'm first trimester pregnant, super sick. I have a pasture full of horses out there that are boarding with me, plus all of my own animals, plus working at the ranch that I work at down the street. But I'm suckered in, you know? I'm like, yes, I want to help this horse if I can, especially if somebody else is going to bail her out. So maybe I can't take her, but I have a lot of horse friends who might be interested. So at this point, I just start blasting her out. I put her on my social media platforms. I sent messages to my friends that were horse people. This is my side note of like, do you see why you don't want to be my friend? Especially if you're a horse person, is because you get suckered into this stuff with me. And actually my business partner, who has a nonprofit, that's where I work at the ranch down the street, she was the first to respond and said, you know what, I will take that horse, just get her here, I'll nurse her back to health and we'll find her a family, or she'll just stay here. Like she was all in with me, and this is why we are a dangerous duo. So I get back to the organization. I'm like, yes, we want her. She had the same shipping date as the two that I had already purchased and secured. At this point, I also contacted the transporter and said, is your trailer big enough to haul this many extra large horses? He says, yes, I'm over the moon. We're good to go. You know, going into this, I had just like eyes for Leo, eventually is, you know, the first one I talked about with you guys. And then now I have three of them. So, which is overwhelming, but also kind of awesome that we're going to get three out instead of just one. So, transporter is there the day after Christmas, drives there, picks them up the next day, 8 a.m. on the dot. I think it was like a Wednesday. They herd them onto the trailer and they start the 12-hour drive to Colorado from Texas. And at this point, fingers are crossed, toes are crossed. I'm sending out like all of the telepathic well wishes that I can that these horses can survive the ride and that they're not suffering too terribly. They were already so fragile and so sick, and trailer loading and trailering is super stressful for horses. So I just knew though, if I could just get them here, that it would be okay. So Otis, Waffles, and Snowflake, there we go. Otis, Waffles, and Snowflake ultimately become Leo, Molly, and Stormy. Stormy was named from her adoptive family, who became involved right away. They arrived late that night. It was Wednesday night. Here's Molly. You can see how spooky she is in this clip. I was trying to just quietly, I guess, walk up to her. I was talking to her so she knew where I was, and she was just really not having it. And then here is Stormy, aka Snowflake, who hitches a ride on the trailer just in the nick of time. I get them settled, they've got food, water, I secure their space. And this is where I make a really big mistake with these horses that could have cost lives almost right away. Again, these horses are coming from Texas. The next morning after they arrive, I head out to go check on them first thing to see how everybody's doing. And I see Leo standing in the corner with his head down, and he's awake, but he's not super alert or responsive to me. And I just think, gosh, this is really weird. And then I look at him a little closer and he's just shaking all over. The girls, Molly and Stormy, had a fairly decent coat. I noticed that Leo didn't have as much of a winter coat, but I also just kind of thought, well, I don't know this horse. It's pitch black out here. Is now a great time to try to get a blanket on him, or should I wait until tomorrow when he's settled in a little bit? And that's ultimately what I did. But he was really struggling that morning. So I nervously go up to him. He lets me put a halter on him. Actually doesn't even lift his head or really respond at all when I halter him. The transporter, who at this point has become a good friend of mine, was already there. He stopped by on the way to work that morning. He works at the ranch down the street from me. He's already there, and I'm like, do I try to get a blanket on this horse? What if he's never seen a blanket before? Well, he lets me blanket him, minimal drama, and continues to do so for the rest of the winter. So that was a good thing, and I should have done that from the beginning. And now I know that was a serious lesson learned. And now they're here, so now what? Well, we just start to nurture them. 3 meals a day, unlimited hay, unlimited water. They had grass to forage on. They had space to move around. They had each other to sort of form this sad little herd of rescue horses. We were giving them supplementation, and we had a really cool group of local people who are coming by regularly to love on them. They were all very, very sick. Goopy, runny noses, gnarly coughs that like would shake their whole body. If they really did any kind of exertion, they would just start to cough. It was definitely some kind of respiratory junk. They were malnourished and underweight. And in Leo's case, complete emaciation. And if you've ever rescued a horse before, which maybe you haven't, but the first few days and weeks are really the scariest, because as you start to refeed them, you don't want to do it too quickly. You don't want to cause organ failure. You don't want to cause colic or any more complications than they're already having. So things really move fairly slowly at that time. I kept them blanketed and warm. I had a vet come out to see if we needed to give them antibiotics for their coughing and for their sickness. And at that time, the vet said, yeah, I think I think all 3 of these horses are probably in their mid-20s, which for a draft horse is very, very old. It's sort of like small dog, big dog, right? Like the smaller the dogs are, the longer they live, the bigger they are, the less they live. In this case, it doesn't get much bigger than a draft horse when we're talking about horses. So we knew, like, okay, these are really old, fragile animals, more so than what we even thought they originally were. All 3 of them are covered in scars on their faces and on their bodies from the work equipment that they have been made to wear as work horses for the Amish. Medically, each one of them had really several things going on. Leo was so beaten down and sick that most of the time he wouldn't even pick his head up. They didn't know what grain was or oats, so I went out there the first time. I remember shaking the bucket, so excited to bring them something yummy to eat, and they didn't even come over. It's like they didn't even know what it was. So he would come over to eat, but for the most part just stood with his head super low and just kind of zoned out. He had severe dropped fetlocks that I will show you pictures of. Basically, if you're not a horse person, it's like walking on your ankles, essentially. Where your ankle would be, it's like super close to the ground, where the ligaments have just been so overworked and used that they're really loose and they're not supporting his legs anymore. And he was so weak that when he would lay down, he couldn't get back up. And one day, I have a footage of this I'm going to show you. One day he did. He laid down and he just couldn't get up again. And it took several grown men who fortunately were close enough that they could come over to help. We had a couple of guys staying with us at the time, and it took 4 or 5 men to get this horse up. So I'll show you what happened that day. He also was just, like I mentioned, severely emaciated and neglected, and his feet were really, really, really overgrown, like gnarly, and that's the whole story. And lastly, we discovered that he is blind in his right eye. Check this out. And here's me showing you that he cannot see out of his right eye. Molly, well, she just didn't really want to be touched at all. She was done with people at this point. We had turned her loose, and she chose to stay very far away from us at all times. She had wounds above her eyes. She had wounds near her hips. Her legs were bleeding down by her pastern, which is like just above their hooves. And we couldn't figure out what that was, because I thought she was maybe hitting her legs on something in the enclosure, but that wasn't what was happening. And so it ended up being like some kind of a mite that the other ones didn't get, but it literally would cause all 4 of her legs to bleed. As you saw from her video, she's fully blind in her left eye, and it happened from having some kind of a traumatic injury. Our best guess is she was probably hit in the face, and then the wound to her eye was never treated, so the eye has literally shrunk back into her head. The eye looked infected. It was weeping and seeping quite a bit, and we couldn't really vet her. Now, Stormy was definitely used and abused as well. Our understanding is she came from a different Amish farm than where Leo and Molly came from. We could see from her video before we ever secured her that she had a huge abscess on her right shoulder. It was like softball size, super fluidy. You could push it and move it around. It was gross. Well, sometime from when we purchased and secured her to when she actually arrived, within those few days, it had burst, and it was completely scabbed over, but it was open enough that it was still seeping, which you want. So we didn't have to do very much for it except just kind of monitor it and make sure that it wasn't filling up again. You'll see in her pictures that she had gnarly facial scars. She had scarring down her shoulders and her back from wearing equipment. And then major problems in her case with her lady parts. So the way that her anatomy was, she basically had no control over her bladder at all. And so at that end of her, she was a complete mess. Which at the time, it was winter, right? So flies aren't really an issue, but it was going to become a problem as we moved into the warmer seasons when the bugs came out. It was something that we were definitely considering and figuring out, like, how are we going to manage this? She was fairly easy to vet, so we knew that it wasn't a UTI or any kind of an infection that was causing that, which the vet said sometimes could happen. It was just the way that her anatomy was, and that she had been clearly used for breeding most of her life. Overall, looking at these 3 horses, it was just really heartbreaking to see the condition that they were in. After they had had time to settle, we had a farrier come out and look at them. Molly adamantly refused that care as well. Stormy allowed us to trim her front feet, but then she ran out of patience with us. And Leo didn't. He allowed the farrier to work on him a little bit, but he was so big and so strong. But we ultimately had the farrier come out 3 different times unsuccessful in the meaning that he was able to attempt it, but Leo was too strong, too wiggly, and being completely alert, it just wasn't happening. This is where it gets hard. Things seem to be going well. We have people in the community that are coming out and helping us take care of them, checking in on them, building trust with them. Refeeding is going well. They're resting, they're sleeping, they're eating, they're doing all the things that we want them to be doing. They're decompressing. But one day I noticed that one of them is down a lot, like laying down a lot. And she often would lay down for naps, so I didn't really think anything of it, but something felt a little bit off. But every time I would go out to check on her, I kind of watched her throughout the day. She would pop right up and come to the gate to greet me. She was eating all of her food. She was drinking. She wasn't colicking. So I just kind of was watching her. The next morning, she can't get up. I'm in the house with the kids. my husband calls me and says she's down. What do we need to do? This turned out to be a really sad day. I hate to do this to you, but this feels like a good place to stop today. Bad things are about to happen for more than one of them. And I want you to prepare your heart for tomorrow's episode. Come back tomorrow, and I'm gonna give you the final leg of this journey, to some extent. What happens to them, which one of them passes away and why. And it's not going to be the one that you think. And I'll share with you where they are now. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the episode when it drops, and I'll see you tomorrow.